All right, the recording has begun. Here I am this morning with Mervyn Taylor, uh, seated in Port of Spain, in Belmont, and I'm here in Rockville, Maryland. Um, Mervyn, good morning.
Morning. Good morning,
Morning.
Andrew.
Yeah.
Morning.
Yeah, we're here to talk about news of the living and Country of Warm Snow, which both very moving books, powerful books released in the recent period. Uh, and about poetry, and the art, the office. And so uh, I'm going to ask a very basic question, which you probably anticipated I would ask, but maybe not. Like, what is a poem? That's a very basic question.
Oh my God. Oh, what is a poem? Um, it's interesting. I was listening to Ferlinghetti, who passed away recently, and
Yeah.
it's one of his sort of almost casual poems. He's talking about poetry, but one of the lines said, and I might be paraphrasing that poetry is the close of the soul, the dressing,
The
the
dress of the
cover,
soul.
the dress of the soul. Yeah, yeah. And I guess that's as good a declaration as any, right?
Yeah, that's a good one, and it gives me an easy segue into the tailoring of a poem, right? And you being a tailor, Mervyn Taylor,
Yeah.
and then the way you begin "Country of Warm Snow" with those wonderful poems about status and City of Tailors.
Yeah.
Would you read City of Tailors? Do you have it handy?
Yes, yes, I do.
Okay,
Yeah.
and then we
Hmm.
can talk about what
Yeah.
you're doing there. Yeah.
Okay. It begins with an epigraph from Derek Walcott. Belmont, City of Tailors, seamlessly stitching June and July together. Derek Walcott. City of Tailors. The tailor shops have all but disappeared. Mr. Wilson keeps his half door open and a yard of lining just in case. Mackie can't see to thread the needle. His last suit sits sleeveless on its mannequin, the customer wearing an old one to the funeral. Jinx rocks in the gallery of the old folks' home, regaling them with tales about how he used to make everyone wait while he catnapped over his singer. Everyone misses them, especially at Carnival, when they made the sailor pants wide, and on Tuesdays when, dressed to compete, they went shopping for chalk and fabric. Their seams always unbroken, even now, as they prepare for that final fitting, the kerchief in the breast pocket, three-pointed and gray, to match the worsted. Thank you.
It's a breathtaking poem. You're talking, about a neighborhood that's changed, it's all but disappeared. You say there's the tailor shops,
Yeah.
uh, but you're also dressing the poem up, right? You're making a perfect little structure there. Tell me about that role of the art, the craftsmanship, where you shape and sculpt a poem to be absolutely, the kerchief right in the breast pocket of the poem, so to speak.
Yes.
The metaphor, I read this poem both as a poem about tailors but also a poem about the making of a poem, of clothes, of many things. Go ahead.
Absolutely. That the poem, in a way, is a tailor constructing a garment, right? That you're making the dress for the soul, you're constructing a garment, and so you have the two things happening at once, right? That I'm describing a time in Belmont that doesn't exist anymore. There are still some tailors, but it's not the magnificent trade that you found on almost every street. And so many of my own family were tailors, right? My uncle Tertius It's an interesting name, Tertius. I should have mentioned him in this poem with Tertius. But you know, so many of us in the colonized world, right, carry these names, historic names like Roman names, you know, like Tertius and Ignatius and so on. So Uncle Tersh, and then there was another uncle, Uncle Leslie, also Taylors, both of them. And Leslie and his brother, the Syke was his nickname, the Syke and his brother, both Taylors, and living in a house, one upstairs and one down. One that's in another poem. One known for pants, and one better known for jackets. So, but and then they had a falling out, and they never spoke again. But that's another story. Yeah, but the poem itself, the making of the poem, like the putting together of a suit, right? And the things I think the things I noticed growing up were those chalk lines that tailors made when you came for a fitting, right? To move a sleeve or to fix a lapel and so on. So yeah, I was very much conscious in the building of this poem about making it like structuring and sewing a suit. Um, there are parts of the poem too that I think I put in, like you say, you know, what Walcott said, the poem is the big lie, right? So you create an edifice, and in a way, a suit is a sort of an edifice, you know, or an artifice which can make a homeless man look decent, right? I remember there was a guy who lived in the park, a homeless guy named Craig. I've written about him too in the park. And I remember the people so loved and admired Craig. He wrote letters to the Queen all the time. And he was famous for his letters being so impeccably written and so on, that the people felt sorry for him. And one Easter presented him with a suit which he wore proudly for maybe all of 3 days, and then went back to his rags and tatters and so on, right? But the idea, again, like you say, of dressing up. And there are some lines in the poem that I put in deliberately because I wanted it not to be all business, to show a part of their sporting life and so on. So the part that says that they dress to compete has to do with stories I heard about and witnessed myself about tailors going into town. They had a particular day in the week, which I think was a Tuesday, to go shopping for fabric and so on. And that was their dress up day. They would put on their fanciest clothes and go to the city, to Port of Spain. And in the city, of course, they would run into the seamstresses, which was another sewing category in Belmont. My sister, Emrys, was a seamstress. So they would meet these women in town, and the women also would be dressed in their finest too, you know. So there was this competition with tailors and the other tradesmen like barbers and so on. But Tuesday was the dress up day. So I very consciously thought of that when I wrote City of Tailors, you know, about this thing about um, wanting to look decent and wanting
Right.
to be sharp, you know, and so.
And there's also the dress up day when one thinks of carnival, right? I mean, you make the costume and you dress in it, and then for that brief moment, those 3 days or something, you wear this costume,
You
and
transformed,
it's
right? Yeah,
transformed, and then it
yeah.
disappears. It becomes a part of a memory. It becomes a memory. Now, uh, I wonder how you whether the dressing up is a kind of ephemeral thing in a sense. I mean, the effect of the poem, on the ear and in memory. I mean, you might remember a line from the poem or a phrase, but it's also it's both a living creature. This poem, and as any living creature, it has it's a mortal creature, and yet at
Yeah,
the same time um, it's perfected to the point where anyone could pick it up. It's published in a book. It can become part of the sort of living history of a language. So I mean, when you write these poems or this poem, "The City of Tailors," are you also thinking about how it'll be read and where it'll be read, and at any to any extent? How will it be performed? In
Yes,
which? Go ahead. If you could.
certainly. Yes, you're quite right. I'm thinking about posterity. I'm thinking about something to be left, right? I'm thinking about Stephen Vincent Benet, who wrote that incredible poem, Notes to be Left in a Cornerstone, right? Which describes the city and the beauty of it and the people that he knows will not last forever. And so he's writing this poem actually as notes to be left for, and it begins the poem, this is for you, this is for you who are to come, that you will discover, you'll see what life was like. And so, yes, I think writing about City of Tailors, it's a bit nostalgic. I'm recalling a time when tailor-made suit, custom-made suits were the rigueur for all the young men, right? Nobody would buy what they call off-the-nail clothes, so to speak, right?
Right, or ready-made clothes.
Or ready-made clothes. As poor as we were, there was something about maintaining that personal touch and so on, right? Um, I think one of the things that prompted this also, besides the idea that I had family members who were tradespeople and proud of their thing. One of
Who were
that
tailors themselves.
who were tailors themselves,
Right.
and one of them I remember in particular, that Tertius Leslie, whom I mentioned, actually was what they call a floor worker in a store in the city called Hoadley's. It's a very British store, and of course their title was Hoadley's, the bespoke tailor. I never figured what I could understand what the word bespoke meant, right? But it has something to do about being very grand, cut above the rest and so on. So I remember walking by the store and watching Uncle Tertius, who was a very tall man, with the measuring tape over his shoulder, walking sort of very proudly across the floor. And these were old-time floors, not very busy, old-time stores with polished wood and not a lot of clutter and so on. But you looked in and you realized that the only reason for you to go in there would be to be measured for something, right? So you sort of admired the grandeur from a distance, right? But to add one other little story about, I think, what prompted writing about City of Tailors, the one I mentioned, Jinx, in the old folks' home, who regaled them with tales.
Right.
Jinx's tailor shop was on Norfolk Street, which is one of the main thoroughfare in Belmont. And so Jinx was famous for telling stories. If you wanted a laugh or you wanted to learn something about the Belmont you stopped by Jinx tailor shop. I'm so sorry. I'm mixing it up. Mackie, I'm sorry, was the tailor. And Mackie, one day we were sitting here at home. It was carnival time, and we were sitting in the veranda, and we saw Mackie at the corner, and he seemed sort of lost. And he was sort of walking up and down. And finally, my cousin went out and sort of rescued him, brought him in, and said, Mackie, what's the problem? And long story short, Mackie had gone to throw out some garbage and got to the corner and became disoriented and couldn't find his way back to his house, which was no more than 30 steps away, but he couldn't. So he was wandering around the neighborhood. And when we brought him in, he was in tears. And we said, Mackie, what happened? He said, I don't recognize any of these places because so many of the houses had been repainted and refinished and so on. But he turned into my lane because he recognized one that had not been changed. That was Olga's house. He said, and the poem I wrote about that too, he says, he recognized Olga, the old one, not repainted, not redone. And it brought him to that door so he could find someone he knew, So, to rescue the image of Mackie from that sort of terror, I wanted to write about the days of
Yeah,
their grandeur, so
that's
to
right.
speak. Yeah,
You, but in writing about their grandeur, you also write about their decline because Mackie can't see to thread the needle, right?
that's
In
right.
his last suit. So you're catching that melancholy of what the grandeur and the end,
Absolutely.
the final fitting. And then one thinks about preparing that suit for the final fitting. I mean, the most splendid suit you can imagine. For what fitting? In the, where is that
Yeah, where is
fitting
that
taking?
fitting? Yeah,
That's right.
yeah.
That's right.
But the old days of funerals now are not like that. I come
Right.
home now and if I go to a funeral, I look around and I'm a bit shocked at the apparel, right? Because people now don't bother wearing black all the time, and they're
Right.
kind of
Right.
very casual in their dress,
Right.
compared to me growing up when all the men had their suits sunning on a
Right.
line in the yard, even
Right.
if they were old and rusty, but they were suits, that's you wouldn't dream of going to a funeral not wearing a suit.
I
Yeah.
love that line. The suits sunning in the yard. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's in another poem.
That's another. Well, you can steal from your other poem and write a
That's
new.
true. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
You know, I I'd like you to reflect on made to measure. The notion of the measuring in your poetry. The way you you break a line, the way whether you think about beats and syllables when you're revising a poem or when you're writing the poem in the first draft, and whether your skills as a seamstress, I mean not a seamstress, as a tailor, when you
Mhm.
make your own costumes because I know you that you also make costumes and you participate in carnival every year. Whether how that making of the costume and the writing of the poem, how are those are related or are they the same thing? Go ahead.
Um, I'm not sure if those two are related, except that they're both creative, right? They're both
Right.
uh, part of the pride, I think, of the saga boy element, which is what we talk about also with this business of tailors, and why tailors had a lot of work to do, because there was a real pride among the men of dressing up, you know. Even the Calypsonians in the tents and so on. In the early days, those guys used to be always sharp, always well dressed, and so on. A Calypsonian would not think of going on stage without a proper suit and so on. The days of Spitfire or Spoiler and those Calypsonians. Yeah. So if when I write, I'm not consciously counting syllables or measuring in that sense, but I am hearing the beat. I am hearing the beat, and I'm conscious of the beat as to when a line falls off and should begin again or should continue. Those things. I think those things are part of a built-in size. What's the word? But the thing that detects earthquakes, seismograph.
Seismic counter, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So I
Geiger
think
counter, I think.
I think there's a seismic measuring tool that comes in the ear to hear the poem as it progresses. And part of it too, I think, is my whole interest in the narrative and storytelling, so that one doesn't break the flow of the story, that the story should continue. And I think that's helpful in deciding how long a line should be and what should continue and where it should fall off at the end and where begin again, where the tone should pick up and rise. So those things determine for me, I think, the shape of the poem. I remember there was a poem I had called The Wall, an early poem I wrote while I was at Columbia. And I remember Walcott commenting on the poem in a group session. He said, it is like that poem, he said, that appears on the page to be nervous, that the whole structure of it is kind of shaky, because it's a poem that talks about a frantic thing. Well, it talks about the sport of, or the habit of running, people picking up the daily habit of running, and not it as an exercise, but also as a kind of a frantic attempt to keep off illness or keep off death and so on, so you would, if you're not a runner, I used to look from my window in Brooklyn at Prospect Park and watch these people, winter, summer, anything, just running, and because I wasn't a runner, I would say, where are they going, so the poem begins with the question, with the whole idea, actually following the idea of Stephen Vincent Beneau's poem about notes to be left in a cornerstone for you who are to come. The poem took that form, borrowed that form from Benet. And so I wrote, in those days, they were always running. So it was a poem actually written to tell the people to come, not in this year, but in the future, about this habit of running that people had in this day and age. So the poem took on a very kind of trembling shape all the way through.
Yeah, fascinating. The notion that you're writing for a future age. You mentioned studying with Derek Walcott. I mean, we've been speaking for some time about one poem, City of Tailors, and all that it implies, which just suggests to me how rich each one of your poems. I mean, one can dig and dig and dig, and all kinds of associations and meanings are there. This is a wonderful tribute to the layering that you put
Thank you.
into your lines. But you also mentioned Walk, and I think maybe we can use that as a bridge to talk about the education of a poet. Because you quote Derek about the city of tailors seamlessly stitching June and July together, and then you had that experience of studying with him and with other poets like Brodsky when you were an apprentice poet, or or were you an apprentice poet at that time? Uh,
Well, no,
uh,
I don't think I was apprentice, except in the formal sense. But I had been writing for quite a while already, and actually had been performing with a group called Bud Jones Poets. It's a group of 6 poets, including Fatisha, Wesley Brown, Dennis Reed, who read at your series, Indran.
right.
Um, and yeah, so I had that kind of experience, but to kind of formalize the whole notion of what it meant to become a poet, I found myself enrolled at Columbia, which is a whole story in itself, which I may speak about if we have a minute. But yeah, so being at Columbia and having Derek as a teacher, it meant a lot, and also Brodsky, and sometimes feeling oneself out of one's depth, so to speak, feeling that, oh, this is not always a casual thing. Poetry is not always casual. Here I would run upon the idea of poetry as something strict and formal, you know,
Right, right.
and it helps to encourage that idea too, right? To balance the idea of free flowing performance and free flowing writing and so on, but to have a sense of what makes a poem, or what might make it last.
But then, when we think about poems and poetry and the general public, and the notions out there in the general uh, in the world about what are poems and why do poems come into being, and one thinks about inspiration, and then one thinks about perspiration as well. I mean, the work of labor. But but how do you avoid losing that inspiration when you workshop a poem, or when you study a poem, when you write a poem with guidance from another poet, or another poet looking over your shoulder and saying, well, where is the music in this line, or you know so tell us about that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
How do you keep your independence, in a
Good
sense?
question. Well, I have the poem recalling the teaching from Derek about the music, reminding one about the music. But I also I think I also go back to knowing something about the rhythm, about the calypso and so on. I always feel like there's a part of my story that the teacher doesn't know, you know, and therefore I compensate with that, right? That the teacher may be able to tell me about the meter and so on, but I can also bring up a good line from anybody, from one of the songs I like, you know, and make that work also. So yeah, I wrote that poem for Derek. This is upon his passing.
I
Was
think
it?
that's the way you finish the book, isn't that right?
Yeah,
After you wrote
the book ends with that poem about Derek, right? His passing. And so his one of his responses to a student um, in the class, showing him a poem at the door. Class is over and we're walking out, and he shows Derek a poem at the door, and Derek reads it very quickly, and he shakes his head and he says, "Yeah," he says, "but ¿dónde está la música, señor?" You know, and that phrase stayed with me. So I ask myself the same question with everything I write, right? That
Yep, I'm going to
where
ask you to read that poem, but I also want you to reflect on the poem next to it, the penultimate poem in the book, which is called "My Father's Jacket,"
my father's jacket.
because I think it unites this conversation as well, because we begin talking about the city of tailors with an epigraph from Derek Walcott, the second poem in the book, and then right at the end there, you talk again about clothing, this
Yeah,
time, and your father, and I would think an important element in any poet's uh,
yeah,
compositions and themes, and then Derek's guidance through, and then I think about the teacher as a kind of a father figure as well, and ask you to reflect on that. Go ahead. Why don't
yeah.
you read? If you I think we have time if you want to read both poems, or
Okay, okay.
yeah.
My father's jacket. Here's a sidebar. That my father's jacket was not one of the showy things that we're talking about, right? The Saga Boy jackets. This was a
Right.
jacket having to do with his job, with work, of which he was very proud, right? Just a regular uh, jacket that he was probably given from the railway authorities to work in. But he took pride in shining his buttons and so on, and making sure that it was what it was should have been. My father's jacket hangs on a line outside on a day when it is snowing. The shoulders are soon covered with white, his body absent between the lapels. It's how I dream him in this place where he has never been. I speak to his shadow, his scent strongest at the time I am idle. In his quiet way, he takes note of my sadness, asks why I don't go home to the house that rises steeply at the back, so the steps must climb to meet the floor. It's where I fell once into a bucket, my whole body fitting like a small animal. He said, "Boy," and left me to my mother. The jacket swings when the wind blows, loose, dancing by itself, and makes me remember the morning of his funeral, when his friends sat in the living room, and Telemac, his closest, asked if he could have it, with its frayed cuffs and collar, the two top brass buttons missing. Yeah,
Beautiful.
I think, yes, sorry.
No, why don't you go ahead and read the Donde Está,
Okay,
the poem, and then we'll talk about these
these two.
and also yeah.
Okay. Donde está for Derek Walcott in memoriam. Only last week I sent you new work, thinking how many lines I should have changed before you received them, frowning and asking the old question, ¿Dónde está la música, señor? I had hoped you would read past the first 10 pages or so, getting to the good stuff. Glasses reflecting the evening light coming off the VG headland, making sure my endings were no longer shrill, that they stopped like the wooden wheels of a donkey cart, the animal knowing where better than the driver. I've been practicing, Derek, holding each word like a dancer before the dip in the backyards where we boys got ready for the girls. I did not paint at an early age as you did. I looked at the living portraits of uncles and aunts, what the saga boys made of their rough stitched, determined selves. These are what I sent you, sir, in disguise, hoping they would get through, that the winds might carry them to where you sat facing the sea. I had no idea they had already arrived, and you had thrown up your hands, impatient with one small error.
Magnificent poems, and and you grant Derek that gesture, one small error.
One small error,
You
yeah.
know, which of course is an imagined gesture. We don't know whether he did indeed may have responded by saying he has written the perfect poem. um, uh,
Yeah.
you know, go ahead. I mean, just talk to us about your father, about Derek, about the relationship with teachers and with progenitors, and how they uh, influence you in your writing and what you write about. Right.
Yeah, well, my father was a quiet man. He didn't say much. Um, Sort of gruff in his exterior, and my friend Susanna used the word taciturn, but I always sensed his love, his affection. He didn't say much, and always the thing was whenever he didn't quite know what to do, it would be to make to refer me to my mother, boy, and of course turn you to your mother, which is what men tend to do in these situations, right? That they emotionally couldn't handle. But I at times when I missed home, being in America, I missed home. I would sort of feel a sense of responsibility to him. And therefore, the metaphor, the idea of his jacket being outside my window with the snow falling on it. And this is a man who had never traveled, never, and who was never really curious about going anywhere, not even to the beach, And an earlier poem about him said, "The man who never saw the sea." And you're living on an island, right? But the neighbor would invite us to the beach, in his small prefect, and we would all be ready to go. And my mother and we'd say, "Come on, Julian," and he would simply just wave peremptorily, and say, "Go ahead," In other words, his thing was always, "I have work to do," At which point he was not working at the railway anymore, but he had taken up the minding of animals, goats, and so on. So his exercise was always just to go to the savannah with the goats and so on, which was a laughing point for some of the other children because they often saw the goats pulling my father down the street, with one hand gripping his pants to keep it from falling, but but no, he didn't see going to the sea as anything fun at all, So I always thought about him, and I talk about that. And the title "No Back Door" came from one of his oft used sayings, right? About "sea have no back door." That was always his answer when we said, "Come on, let's go." So there. So here is this jacket. And again, another reference to a friend of my father's, Telemac, who in the days when my father was ill and not far from dying, that Telemac was the one friend who came on. Because as I said, my father was not a very sort of open, easygoing fellow. So he didn't have a lot of friends, And this Telemac would come and sit with him for hours, And even if my father wasn't talking, Telemac would keep the conversation going. So that was part of that. Derek, again, as much as Derek talked and so on, he had a sort of a gruff thing about him too, if you might recognize, and did not really brook much foolishness when it came to poetry, especially. Very serious about the written word. Hence why I say that he would throw up his hands at finding a small error. It was about being very precise. One of the things that I mentioned here, and which I kind of read quickly through, I guess hoping that nobody notices, but is the line where I say that Derek is his glasses reflecting the light of the VG headlines, making sure my endings were no longer shrill. One of the things I had, not a difficult, but one of the things that Derek noted while I was at Columbia was that my poems, in trying to find a right ending, I always sort of move towards ending with a kind of up, like a shout, not a shout, but an ending that would be like a signature at the end. And he commented one time when I read something in class, he said, why are your endings shrill? He said, almost like a run on the piano that you would do at the end of a song, to sort of finish. And so all my life now, or since then, I'm always particular about endings in poems. I try my best to craft them, to downplay the music if I find it going into a kind of crescendo. And there are times when a crescendo is natural, right? But I work very hard on endings of poems.
Fascinating, because I mean, imagine going back over all of the many poems you've written
To
and
find
putting the shrill back, you know, you know, a late rebellion against
a
the
late
structure,
rebellion. Yes, that's true.
because
That's true.
I think of Ginsberg. He once told me, he took up one of my first poems and he actually cut out half of it. And he said,
Mm,
"This is what I do with every one of my poems. I cut half the first draft out," and that stayed with me and it stayed with me. But whether I ever believed it, absolutely, I don't know, because
yeah.
I look at his poems and I think, how could he have cut half of Kaddish out, or how? But going
Yes.
back to this, to Walcott and to your father, and I'm just curious also about the jacket. I mean, it's an imagined experience, right? The snow
Yes.
falling on this jacket. Who ended up with the jacket? Did Telemark end up with the jacket in real life? I mean, I'm just curious.
Well, again, here we go with the big lie of poetry, right?
Yeah,
I recall Telemac being in the house. In those days, with funerals, very often the body was brought back to the house for the final, before the final cortege to the graveyard. And so you'd have the body almost what you might call laying in state, in the living room or something. And so my recollection is that Telemac was there. I don't recall him asking me for the jacket, but in my poetic mind, I am assuming that this is something that Telemac would want. As much as he was loyal to my dad,
right,
I
right.
could see him that would be something he would treasure. And noting also that in the uniforms of the railway workers, my father wore that blue serge jacket, wool jacket, where Telemac, who was more of a workman, like a cleaner, wore khaki. And so I saw then my father's blue jacket as something that he would treasure for himself, like an up, yeah.
I wonder if there was a class distinction there between your father and then Telemac, then also.
Well, well, my father was a conductor and Telemac was, so yeah, you could recognize that the uniform dress would indicate class. But they were good friends, and again, my father was not an easy person to be friends with,
Right.
because, like I say, he was gruff and he was solitary. But Telemac never betrayed his affection for him. He would come and visit all the
Right.
time. Yeah.
I must say, I think I was a little ambitious in beginning this conversation, asking to reflect on two books, because we've ended up reflecting on two or three poems, and
Yeah.
and uh, and we're running into well, I mean, we've been speaking for about 40 minutes. I think we should turn to news of the living and to finish this particular conversation, in any case. And
Okay.
and I thought maybe we could connect it by thinking about that question that Walcott asked, "Donde está la música?" You know, and I mean, frankly, News for Living is a great book. It's a
Thank you.
testament to our time. It's it's a it's a reported book in a way. It's a response to directly to this pandemic, and yet the poems are have and will have a very long shelf life. You know, they work. Uh, they can be read at any time, and I'm sure they will be read. So it's a book that merits a longer study. But I want to just mention a couple of things and ask you to think about uh,
Mhm.
thinking about music and word music. And um, you know, one of the last poems in News of the Living is called "Now There's Hardly Anyone Around," and
Mm.
and it finishes with this lines from the Calypso. Uh,
Yes,
I have to say, back to back, belly to belly, we don't give a damn because we done dead
I'm
already.
dead
Now, you
already.
know, when you have that, that's like a gift from God, right? You have those lines. So I don't know which Calypso that's from, but you can talk about that and talk about how you yourself make music with your poetry. Do you feel that you are a musician with words? It's a large question about when you define yourself and whether and also how do you perhaps you can talk about this particular poem. Now there's hardly anyone around, and why you chose to end on those particular lines. Go ahead. Yeah.
um, yeah, I think that again, poetry as an oratory skill, right? That they're meant to be read. I mean, as much as they make their work on the page, they're meant to be heard, you know. And so there's something about the way that the lines move, and something about the way that the characters in the poems are very important to me, and it's important for me to illuminate the way in which they interact with each other and so on. So I don't just want to be the voice telling their story. I want I want to be very much aware of them as living creatures, as creatures that come alive in the poem, so that when I read the poem, you hear it. I want you to see what they're doing and to feel what they feel, you know, and therefore, um, so that when I talk again, going back to the poem about the tailors, about the pocket with the 3 points there, that you want that to be a conscious act on the part of the people who you're talking about. And so, yeah, I think I write to have the music be there as it is happening, and not like an afterthought. It's very present. So I don't know. That's a poem. It's interesting. You know, that's the one poem in all the times I have been doing these virtual readings. That's the one poem that I have not read, you know.
Ah,
And I must tell you why. But I'm glad you put it in a positive way. After I wrote it, I said, you know, there's some people who may not like the idea that I talk about we done that already in a kind of a playful way when this tragic thing, business of the virus is going on, and there are all these bodies and so on. So to talk about dancing and to talk about being bringing back some old calypso seems a little bit irreverential, you know.
right, right.
But now that you've put it in that light, I feel good about it now that you've said it like that. I don't know if you want me to read that
Yeah.
one.
Why don't you
Yeah,
Why don't you
yeah.
read it, and then we can talk about this poem and
Mm.
others in News of the Living. Which
Okay.
okay, go ahead.
And being here in Trinidad, you know, as you know, I haven't been back to Brooklyn in over a year, and somehow this is a sort of a ritual dance that I think to sort of celebrate the end of this pandemic period. Now there's hardly anyone around, and I choose the space that's in Brooklyn, in the on the intersection where I live. I choose an open space to dance with you, the subway station, the board teller smiling as we go around his booth, down the uptown stairs to the deserted platform, headphones sync to some oldie, heaven, I'm in heaven, while the world stays inside, safe from the virus. In the middle of a second seven-way intersection, the one outside my window, our reflection in the McDonald's glass, part of the menu, the egg, your hat, the sausage, my pants. We ignore the cop on the corner till he tires blowing his whistle. I tango you the length of the block where them boys used to lime. And the skating rink in the park is all ours. Ducking under the chains we go in, change our tune to something jumpy like more Soka, the Despa's version. And I hear the I brought while you take your solo, and I follow, holding the note till you come down for our big finish, back to back, belly to belly. We don't give a damn because we done dead already.
That's a song of the Despers, is it? The Despers version of the More
Well,
Soka.
More Soka was a song by this young woman, Nyla Blackman, and Desperados played that song for the Panorama last year. Just an incredible version. So that's just my tipping my hat to some local band, to Despas and so on, you know.
But the lines back to back, belly to belly, come from the song.
Come from a very old calypso. And
Okay.
I'm sorry that I don't have at hand the name of the person who sung it, but it's an old, well-known, almost like a folk song, you know,
Right.
back to back, belly to
Right.
belly. Yeah.
It's a wonderful, wonderful finish, and I'm so glad you rescued those lines from that old calypso in your poem. You know, and again, I mean, there's so much to speak about, but I think we could, maybe I can, we can finish this particular conversation with this poem, and then the very last one in the book, Epilogue, which, given that we're at the end of the viral season, to quote your line, the viral season, in the sense that we are seeing glimmers of hope through the virus being stymied, held up by vaccines, and at least in certain parts of the world, and people started to think about an after pandemic life again, you know, and um, and yet in that after pandemic life, we're going to have again the foot pressed on the neck,
On the neck. Yeah.
and so if you could read Epilogue, and then we can perhaps finish talking about these two poems. Go ahead.
Epilogue. On an asteroid called COVID-19 came riding the figure of a man named George, which, when it hit, opened such a crater in the conscience of mankind that the protesters are marching still. The roads they travel littered with statues of men whose fortunes are being rewritten as ill-gotten, chains they used to bind others, now yanking their likenesses from their pedestals. George, his eyes focused on the feet of onlookers, called to a mother dead 2 years to the day, while the world, alerted to his cry, awoke to the fire seen from every window. An asteroid aimed for the earth did not miss this time, opened a hole in the heart of Minnesota that lies smoking like a barbecue pit on the 4th of July, around which folks, having lost their appetite, seek to rescue George from the flame.
Yeah, powerful, powerful poem. Um, and I perhaps it's not for a poet to opine about whether the society can rescue George from the flame, but why don't
Mm.
you go ahead and talk about, well, can we this which I tend to use quite often in my own poetry, rescue George from the flame?
Well, I think the business of rescuing George from the flame, once begun, will never stop. You know, I think that turn has been made in our direction as people of this earth. I think I think there's a corner that has been turned, and that there will be no going back at all. As much as the road remains bumpy, as much as it will remain trial after trial of all sorts, more children coming to the border, more violence, more school shootings, sorry to predict, but more mass shootings and so on. As much as those may continue, our response after George will be different. Our response cannot remain the same. We cannot go back again to what we thought was normal. That the change has been made in the minds of men and women, the way we see each other, the way we envision a future for ourselves. I think more and more we come to realize it is a future for all. It can't be a future just for us. It must be a future for everyone, you know. And therefore, the future that we are looking at is always going to be touched with a kind of, somewhere there'll be an honest finger, right? Somewhere there will be some sense of honesty pervading, that no matter the duplicity, no matter the lies that continue to be told, the standard of honesty has been raised and it cannot be denied anymore. I think that's the way
I
the
think
world must
you
go.
have stated it so beautifully. I hesitate to add any word or ask any other question.
Please do, please do. Yeah.
Well, I mean, perhaps just in the interest of uh, an audience members, two steps forward, one step back. Maybe these are two giant steps forward we've made after George Floyd's killing, assassination, murder. Perhaps I think, and then you talk about oneness, about all of us understanding that we are in this together. And I think about the climate crisis, the general crisis facing humanity and the planet. And
Mhm.
I think about, and then let me ask the question: where does the poet uh, come down? And what can, and where can, how can we use news of the living to keep us living? This book.
Well, the idea that the voice of poetry has been raised all over the world, right? I mean, there's never been an outpouring, I think, like this. You know, poetry used to be the business of parlors and so on, right? Of salons, you know. But now the voice of poetry is everywhere, from every nation. And more we're talking about translations. We're talking about hearing poems from Syria and poems from China and poems from everywhere. And the interest is there, and we cannot go back, right? I think it was Ishmael Reed who said something about, once a work of art has crossed the border, we cannot bring it back. You know? And so this is what's happening, right? That we have voices are raised, people are on the march, and we saw it after George Floyd, and not on the march only in America, but on the march everywhere, everywhere. Even in places where death is the threat. In Europe, in Russia, in today in Myanmar, right? The people are
Right, right.
putting their bodies on the line. They say they will kill poets, you know, and poets are still reading and talking, you know. So much so that I think I read yesterday in the paper that they have released some of the prisoners, the government in Myanmar. So it means that something is happening. Once it begins to happen, then the doubt is minimum. The doubt will always be on the decline, and the positivity will be on the rise. There's no other way. Otherwise, we'll have no place to sleep.
Right. So we have advanced from that day when Martin Luther King said he may not live to see the promised land, but that the promised land was was there, that was coming down the road.
Well, I think
I mean,
we
I'm
realize,
misquoting him, but you
yeah,
understand.
yeah. But I think we realize too that the promised land is not milk and honey, right? We realize that the promised land is a land of our own shaping and making, you know. And therefore, again, poetry, right? Where actually an edifice constructed in the air, without material. It's not like prose where there's a page and there are the lines and it's all, but the poem constructed almost out of nothing, and made to stand without scaffolding, so to speak, right? Just made to stand with a prayer, kind
Right.
of, right? Yeah.
And before the bayonet and before the
Yes.
tank. Though we have lost some poets in Myanmar, but yes, some are
Yeah.
being released. That is a good
It's a good
news.
sign. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mervyn, for reflecting on your poetry on these two books. Really, on some poems, they're rich. There are many, each poem in each of these books is worth
Thank you,
many,
Indra.
many, many hours of reflection. Thank you, and
Thank you.
look forward to sharing this with the world.
So
And
kind.
all
Thank
the
you so
best.
much.
Cheers. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.